Have you ever witnessed injustice so blatant it left you speechless? Pilot denies black woman first-class seat, immediately fired after her husband steps in. How far would you go to stand up for what's right, even at 30,000 feet in the air? This story isn't just about a flight, it's about courage, justice, and an unexpected twist that left everyone speechless. When a black woman was denied her rightful seat in first class by a pilot who thought he had all the power, she could have stayed silent. But what happened next? Let's just say it turned the entire flight upside down, and no one saw it coming. Before we begin, where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. If you love inspiring stories of resilience and justice, make sure to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more incredible tales from dark stories. Your support helps us share these impactful stories with even more people. Now, let's get into it. The airport buzzed with the familiar rhythm of hurried footsteps, rolling suitcases, and announcements echoing across the terminal. Naomi Carter adjusted the strap of her leather tote bag on her shoulder as she stood in the first-class check-in line. Her warm brown eyes scanned the screen of her phone, double-checking her itinerary for the third time. This trip was more than just a flight, it was an opportunity she had worked tirelessly for. As the keynote speaker at a prestigious global summit on business innovation, she had spent months perfecting her presentation. The honor of being the first black woman to headline the event wasn't lost on her, and she carried the weight of expectations with quiet determination. "Miss Carter," the check-in agent's polite voice interrupted her thoughts. Naomi stepped forward, flashing a courteous smile. The agent, a young man with a welcoming demeanor, scanned her ticket. For a fleeting moment, his expression shifted, curiosity, perhaps surprise, but he recovered quickly. "First class, everything looks in order. Have a pleasant flight, Miss Carter." "Thank you," Naomi said, sliding her boarding pass into her purse. She wasn't oblivious to the occasional double-take she received when traveling first class, especially when dressed as she was, a simple but elegant navy blue blazer paired with tailored slacks and understated gold accessories. Her look was professional yet modest, a reflection of her personality. Still, there were always moments like these, reminders of the biases she often encountered. As she approached security, Naomi took a deep breath. This was just another trip, she reminded herself. She wasn't here to prove anything to anyone. The terminal was quieter at gate 14. Naomi arrived early, giving herself enough time to relax before boarding. She settled into a chair near the window, pulling out her tablet to review her presentation slides. The light streaming through the glass caught the shimmer of her wedding ring, a detail she often found comforting during solo travels. Jonathan, her husband, always said it represented more than their love. It was a reminder that she never faced anything alone. As the boarding announcement crackled through the speakers, Naomi stood and joined the priority line. Around her, the murmurs of other passengers blended into the background, but one voice stood out. "Are you sure this is the first-class line?" Naomi turned to see a middle-aged man in a crisp pilot uniform. His silver hair was neatly combed back, and his sharp blue eyes were locked on her with a look that bordered on suspicion. "Yes," Naomi replied evenly, holding up her ticket. He didn't respond immediately, his gaze flicking from her face to the boarding pass in her hand. The seconds stretched uncomfortably. Finally, he nodded, though his expression remained guarded. "Enjoy your flight," he said curtly, stepping aside to let her pass. Naomi's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. It wasn't the first time she'd been scrutinized in spaces where people assumed she didn't belong. Still, there was something unsettling about the man's tone, like a challenge issued without words. She shook it off, determined not to let anything spoil her mood. The interior of the aircraft was a seamless blend of luxury and efficiency. The plush cream-colored seats in the first-class cabin exuded comfort, a stark contrast to the narrower rows further back. Naomi found her seat, 2A by the window, and began organizing her things. As she stowed her tote bag under the seat, the same voice from earlier startled her. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside." Naomi straightened to see the pilot, his arms crossed, standing in the aisle. Several passengers glanced over, curiously, their expressions a mix of confusion and mild interest. "I'm sorry, is there an issue?" she asked, her tone measured. "Yes," he said, his voice firm. "There's been a mistake." This seat isn't yours. Naomi frowned, pulling out her boarding pass. This is 2A, and my ticket clearly states. I'm aware of what the ticket says, he interrupted, his words clipped. But I'm asking you to step aside while we sort this out. A hush fell over the cabin, the murmurs beginning again, louder this time, as passengers exchanged glances. Naomi's cheeks burned, but she refused to shrink under his gaze. There's nothing to sort out, she said, holding up the pass for him to see. I purchased this seat, and I'm not moving. The pilot's lips thinned into a hard line. Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one more time to move, otherwise I'll have to involve security. The implication hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. Naomi inhaled deeply, willing herself to remain calm. You're welcome to call them, she said firmly, sliding into her seat. But I'm not going anywhere. The tension was palpable as the pilot retreated, muttering under his breath. Moments later, 2 security officers appeared at the cabin door, their presence drawing even more attention. Naomi sat tall, her heart pounding, but her resolve unwavering. Ma'am, one officer began, his tone apologetic, we've been asked to escort you off the plane. For what reason? Naomi asked, her voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. There's a dispute about your seat. There's no dispute, Naomi cut in, holding up her ticket. This seat is mine. Are you asking me to leave because I'm black? The question hung in the air, a sharp knife cutting through the whispers. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly caught off guard. The pilot reappeared, his face red with frustration. This isn't about race, he snapped. It's about following protocol. Your protocol seems selective, Naomi shot back, standing now, her voice carrying the weight of years spent navigating such encounters with grace and grit. If I were anyone else, would you be questioning my right to be here? The pilot opened his mouth to respond, but was interrupted by a commanding voice from behind. What's going on here? Heads turned as a tall, broad-shouldered man in a tailored suit stepped into the cabin. His expression was calm, but his dark eyes blazed with intensity. Naomi felt a surge of relief and surprise. Jonathan! But wait, will this confrontation change everything? The pilot visibly faltered. This doesn't concern you, sir. Oh, but it does, Jonathan said, his voice dangerously low. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an ID badge. The color drained from the pilot's face as he read the title, Jonathan Carter, Executive Vice President, North American Operations, SkyConnect Airlines. The cabin fell silent, every passenger waiting to see what would happen next. The hush in the first-class cabin was deafening, save for the soft hum of the plane's ventilation system. All eyes were on the tall, commanding figure of Jonathan Carter as he slowly returned his ID badge to the inner pocket of his blazer. His movements were deliberate, his expression one of calculated control. Jonathan wasn't just Naomi's husband, he was a man who commanded respect wherever he went, and today was no different. Naomi, standing by her seat, felt a wave of emotions. Relief washed over her at Jonathan's unexpected presence, but a simmering anger remained, anger at the indignity of the situation, at being forced to defend herself in a space she had every right to occupy. Jonathan's gaze flicked between the pilot, who now stood rigid and uncomfortable, and the 2 security officers, who looked increasingly uneasy. Would someone care to explain why my wife is being harassed in her rightful seat? Jonathan's voice was calm, measured, but it carried the weight of authority. It was the kind of voice that demanded answers. The pilot, Captain Jack Thornton, straightened his shoulders in a futile attempt to reclaim his composure. Mr. Carter, this is simply a misunderstanding, he began, though his voice betrayed a hint of defensiveness. There was an issue with the passenger's ticket. There is no issue with her ticket, Jonathan interjected, his tone sharpening. He reached for Naomi's boarding pass, which she handed to him without a word, holding it up for the entire cabin to see. He continued, this clearly states first-class seat 2A. If there's any misunderstanding, it's on your part, Captain. Captain Thornton's jaw tightened. He was a man unaccustomed to being questioned, especially not by someone of Jonathan's stature. I was following protocol, he said, his voice taut. We have to ensure all passengers belong in the seats they've been assigned. And you determined my wife didn't belong here because... Jonathan let the question hang, his piercing gaze fixed on the pilot. Thornton hesitated, his eyes darting to Naomi, then to the passengers watching intently. The cabin seemed to shrink under the weight of the silence. "I acted based on the information available at the time," the pilot finally said, sidestepping the implication. Jonathan took a deliberate step closer, his towering presence making the pilot visibly uncomfortable. "Let me make one thing clear," Jonathan said, his voice dropping to a near growl. "My wife doesn't just belong here, she worked harder than most people on this plane to earn her place. What she does not deserve is to be publicly humiliated by someone who should know better." The murmurs of the passengers grew louder, a low tide of agreement rippling through the cabin. Naomi felt their eyes on her, some sympathetic, others curious. She remained standing, her posture a perfect picture of grace under fire. This wasn't the first time she'd faced adversity, and it likely wouldn't be the last, but having Jonathan by her side gave her strength she hadn't realized she needed. The two security officers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unsure of how to proceed. One of them cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter, we were only called in to de-escalate the situation," he said carefully. "If there's no issue with Mrs. Carter's ticket, we're happy to step away." Jonathan gave the officer a curt nod. "You're dismissed." The officers wasted no time retreating to the front of the plane, their presence no longer required. Jonathan turned his attention back to Thornton, whose bravado had all but evaporated. "I'm going to ask you one final time," Jonathan said, his voice as cold as steel. "Why did you single out my wife?" Thornton's face flushed, his silence more telling than any answer he could have given. The truth was evident to everyone in the cabin, but he lacked the courage to admit it outright. Naomi finally spoke, her voice steady but edged with the frustration she'd held back for too long. "Captain Thornton, let's not waste any more time. If you're going to accuse me of something, do it outright. But understand this, I will not be intimidated, and I will not be silenced." The power in her words resonated, drawing nods from several passengers. Thornton shifted uncomfortably, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He opened his mouth to respond, but a sudden voice cut through the tension. "This isn't the first time he's done this," a woman's voice said from across the aisle. All heads turned to a middle-aged woman seated in 3C, her face stern, her gaze fixed on Thornton. "I've flown with this airline for years," she continued. "And I've seen him question people like her before, always subtle, always careful, but it's a pattern." Thornton's eyes widened in alarm. "That's completely unfounded." "Is it?" Jonathan said, cutting him off, his eyes burning with quiet fury. "Because if there's a pattern here, you can bet I'll uncover it." Thornton's attempt to defend himself unraveled quickly under Jonathan's scrutiny. Passengers began whispering amongst themselves, some recalling their own experiences, others voicing support for Naomi. The tide had turned, and Thornton stood alone against a growing wave of accountability. "Captain Thornton," Jonathan said, his voice ringing with finality, "you are relieved of your duties effective immediately. I'll be filing a formal complaint with the airline's board, and I'll personally ensure this incident is fully investigated." The pilot's face paled. "You can't." "Oh, I can," Jonathan said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And I will." Thornton's shoulders slumped, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. He looked to the crew for support, but none was offered. Even the flight attendants avoided his gaze, unwilling to align themselves with a sinking ship. Naomi, still standing tall, turned to Jonathan. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions coursing through her. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch both protective and reassuring. "You never have to thank me for standing by your side," he said. As Thornton was escorted off the plane, Naomi took her seat, the murmurs of the passengers slowly fading into silence. Jonathan knelt beside her, his hand gently covering hers. "Are you okay?" he asked. She nodded, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I am now." Jonathan smiled, but his eyes carried a flicker of sadness. "I'm sorry you had to go through that." Naomi squeezed his hand. "It's not the first time, and it probably won't be the last, but we handled it together." As the plane prepared for takeoff, Naomi leaned back in her seat, her gaze shifting to the window. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of gold and orange. It was a quiet reminder of resilience, a promise that no matter how dark things might seem, the light always found a way through. The plane settled into an uneasy silence as the hum of the engines filled the void left by Captain Thornton's departure. Passengers exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of discomfort, curiosity, and quiet awe at what had just transpired. Naomi sat back in her seat, her fingers brushing lightly over the smooth leather armrest. The tension in her chest was beginning to unwind, but a small knot of anger still lingered, tangled with exhaustion. Jonathan remained kneeling beside her, his presence steady and grounding. He didn't rush her, didn't bombard her with reassurances or attempts to lighten the mood, he simply stayed close, watching her carefully as if trying to read the thoughts she hadn't yet voiced. Naomi appreciated that about him, his ability to sense when she needed space even as he provided silent support. She finally turned her head to meet his gaze. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly, her voice barely carrying over the low murmur of the cabin. Jonathan's brow furrowed. "Of course I did." "No," she said, shaking her head gently, "I mean you didn't have to come onto the plane. You could have handled it from outside, but you walked in here in front of everyone and put yourself on the line." Jonathan's lips quirked into a small rueful smile. "Naomi, you're my wife. There's no line I wouldn't cross for you." His words were simple, yet they carried a weight that pressed gently against her heart. For a moment, she allowed herself to lean into that comfort, letting it fill the spaces left hollow by the day's events. From her seat, Naomi could feel the eyes of the other passengers lingering on her. She glanced around, meeting a few gazes, some warm with quiet solidarity, others hesitant or curious, as if unsure how to process what they'd witnessed. A man 2 rows back gave her a small nod, and a young woman across the aisle mouthed, "You're amazing." Naomi smiled faintly, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than triumph. She didn't feel amazing, if anything, she felt drained. The adrenaline that had surged through her moments earlier was now ebbing, leaving her muscles heavy and her thoughts slow. A flight attendant approached cautiously, her polished heels clicking softly against the carpeted aisle. She was young, with wide brown eyes that darted nervously between Naomi and Jonathan. Her name tag read Erica, and her hands were clasped tightly in front of her. "Mrs. Carter," Erica began, her voice tentative, "I just wanted to apologize for everything. What happened back there was completely unacceptable, and on behalf of the crew, I'm really sorry." Naomi studied her for a moment. Erica's sincerity seemed genuine, but Naomi had learned long ago to measure apologies not just by words but by the actions that followed. "Thank you," Naomi said evenly. "I appreciate you saying that." Erica hesitated, as if expecting Naomi to say more, but when nothing else came, she offered a nervous smile and excused herself. As she walked away, Naomi noticed the furtive glance Erica shot toward the cockpit, where a new pilot had presumably taken over. It was a reminder that even in Thornton's absence, the echoes of his behavior still lingered. As the plane began taxiing toward the runway, Jonathan rose and took his seat across the aisle. Naomi watched him settle in, his expression thoughtful as he pulled out his phone to check emails. He was always like this, balancing the personal and the professional with a quiet determination that sometimes made her wonder how he managed it all. Naomi turned her attention to the window, where the last rays of sunlight painted the tarmac in hues of amber and rose. The view reminded her of a line from her keynote speech, "Innovation isn't born from comfort, it's forged in the fires of adversity." She had written those words with her career in mind, but today they felt oddly personal. She thought about the pilot's sneering tone, the assumptions he had made about her without knowing anything about her life, her accomplishments, or her character. It wasn't just about a seat on a plane, it was about the silent battles fought every day by people who, like her, were forced to justify their place in spaces they had every right to occupy. A soft sigh escaped her lips. She wasn't naive, she knew this wouldn't be the last time she encountered prejudice. But it was the first time in a long while that she had been forced to confront it so publicly, and the weight of that realization settled heavily on her shoulders. A few minutes into the flight, as the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, there was a light knock on Naomi's armrest. She turned to see the middle-aged woman from 3C standing beside her, holding a small tray with 2 glasses of champagne. "I thought you might like this," the woman said with a kind smile. "It's on the house, or at least it should be." Naomi chuckled softly, accepting the glass. "Thank you," That's very thoughtful of you. The woman shrugged, setting the second glass on Jonathan's tray table. It's the least I could do. I've seen too much of what you dealt with today, and I'm tired of staying silent. People need to start speaking up. Naomi studied the woman's face, searching for something beyond the surface kindness. There was a weariness in her eyes, a quiet acknowledgement of shared experiences. It was a small but meaningful gesture, and Naomi accepted it for what it was. I appreciate that, Naomi said sincerely. The woman nodded and returned to her seat, leaving Naomi to sip her champagne in silence. The bubbles tickled her tongue, a subtle reminder that even in the midst of chaos, there were moments of sweetness. As the flight progressed, Jonathan leaned across the aisle, his voice low so as not to disturb the other passengers. Naomi, he said, his tone soft but firm, this isn't over. She glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. What do you mean? I mean Thornton, he said, and anyone else like him. This isn't just about today, it's about making sure something like this doesn't happen to you or anyone else again. Naomi set her glass down, her fingers tracing the stem thoughtfully. She understood what he was saying, and a part of her was grateful for his determination, but another part of her felt the familiar tug of exhaustion. Fighting these battles was necessary, but it was also draining. Jonathan, she began carefully, I appreciate everything you've done, I do, but you can't fix the world overnight. No, he agreed, his eyes steady on hers, but I can start with this airline, and I can make damn sure they know who they're dealing with. His words were a promise, not just to her, but to anyone who had ever been made to feel small. Naomi nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. She didn't have the energy to argue, and deep down, she knew he was right. The cabin lights dimmed as the crew prepared for the evening service. Naomi reclined her seat, letting her eyes drift shut. Sleep didn't come easily, but the rhythmic vibrations of the plane and the steady hum of the engines created a cocoon of white noise that lulled her into a light doze. As the plane soared through the darkening sky, Naomi found herself thinking not of the day's events but of the future, of a world where stories like hers wouldn't need to be told. It was a dream, perhaps a distant one, but it was hers to hold on to. The hum of the airplane engines filled the dimly lit cabin, steady and unchanging, a soothing background to the quiet conversations and faint rustling of passengers settling in for the night. Naomi sat upright, the glass of champagne now empty on her tray table, her thoughts refusing to settle. She glanced across the aisle at Jonathan, who was reading something on his tablet, the glow from the screen softening his sharp features. She admired how composed he always seemed, even in moments of conflict, yet she knew him well enough to recognize the undercurrent of frustration simmering beneath his calm exterior. Jonathan wasn't the type to let injustices go unchecked, and Naomi knew he wouldn't rest until he had addressed what had happened today. Her gaze drifted toward the window, where the inky darkness of the night sky stretched endlessly, tiny pinpricks of stars blinking faintly, distant and untouchable. The view was both calming and unsettling, a reminder of the vastness of the world and how small her struggles might seem in the grander scheme of things. But even small struggles could feel monumental when they were personal. A soft knock on her armrest interrupted her thoughts. Naomi turned to find the young flight attendant, Erica, standing beside her again. This time, she held a steaming cup of tea on a small saucer, her expression tentative but earnest. I thought you might like this, Erica said, her voice quiet but steady. I know it's not much, but it's chamomile. It might help you relax. Naomi studied the young woman for a moment, noting the slight tremble in her hands as she held the saucer. It was clear Erica was nervous, though Naomi wasn't sure if it was because of the earlier confrontation or something else entirely. Thank you, Naomi said, accepting the tea with a small smile. She didn't have the heart to refuse the gesture, even though her mind was too restless to truly relax. Erica lingered for a moment, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. Mrs. Carter, I just wanted to say I really admire how you handled everything earlier. A lot of people would have, well, I don't think I could have been as calm as you were. Naomi tilted her head, her expression softening. Sometimes calm is the only choice you have, she said. But thank you, that means a lot. Erica nodded, her lips curving into a faint smile. If you need anything else during the flight, please don't hesitate to ask. As Erica walked away, Naomi sipped her tea, savoring the warmth that spread through her hands and chest. The kindness, however small, was a balm for the lingering sting of the day's events. As the flight settled into its routine, Naomi leaned back in her seat, allowing her eyes to drift closed. Sleep didn't come easily, but the rhythmic vibrations of the plane and the steady hum of the engines created a cocoon of white noise that lulled her into a light doze. She wasn't sure how much time had passed when she heard Jonathan's voice, low and measured, speaking to someone nearby. Blinking her eyes open, she turned her head to see him conversing with the woman from 3C, the same woman who had brought them champagne earlier. They spoke in hushed tones, but there was a quiet intensity to their exchange that piqued Naomi's curiosity. Jonathan glanced in her direction, catching her gaze and gesturing for her to join them. Naomi unbuckled her seatbelt and moved to the seat beside him, her movements slow and deliberate, still shaking off the haze of near-sleep. "This is Mrs. Patricia Moore," Jonathan said, introducing the woman. "She has something you might want to hear." Patricia extended a hand, her grip firm but warm. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Carter. I hope you don't mind my intruding." "Not at all," Naomi replied, taking the seat beside her husband. "What's this about?" Patricia leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "It's about Thornton, the captain from earlier." Naomi felt her muscles tense. "Go on." Patricia sighed, her expression hardening. "I've been flying with this airline for years, and I've seen him pull stunts like that more times than I can count, always subtle, always targeting people he thinks won't fight back. But today was different. Today he pushed too far." Naomi exchanged a glance with Jonathan, who nodded slightly, encouraging her to listen. "I'm a retired HR executive," Patricia continued. "I've seen men like him come and go, and let me tell you, if someone doesn't put a stop to it, they only get bolder. I wanted to say something earlier, but I didn't know how it would be received. Now I'm sure of it, people need to know the truth about him." "What are you suggesting?" Naomi asked carefully. Patricia straightened, her resolve evident. "I'm saying I'll back you up if you decide to pursue this. I'll testify, give a statement, whatever it takes to make sure he doesn't get away with it again." Naomi's heart swelled with gratitude, but also with the weight of what Patricia's offer represented. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about holding someone accountable for years of unchecked behavior. "Thank you," Naomi said, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. "That means more than I can say." Patricia smiled, a warm, reassuring gesture. "You're welcome. And for what it's worth, I think you handled yourself brilliantly today." After Patricia returned to her seat, Naomi and Jonathan sat in silence for a moment, each lost in their thoughts. The cabin lights had dimmed further, casting soft shadows across their faces. The atmosphere felt heavy, but not oppressively so, more like the calm before a storm. "Do you think she's right?" Naomi asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "about pursuing this?" Jonathan turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "I think it's your decision to make," he said. "But if you want my opinion, yes, she's right. Thornton needs to be held accountable, not just for you, but for everyone he's wronged." Naomi nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the empty teacup on her tray table. She thought about the countless moments in her life when she had chosen to let things slide, to keep the peace, to avoid making waves. But this time felt different. This time, she had the support she needed to stand up and say enough is enough. "I'll think about it," she said, her tone firm but contemplative. Jonathan reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you." Naomi looked at him, her heart swelling with love and gratitude. "I know." As the plane continued its journey through the night, Naomi leaned back in her seat, her thoughts a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. The weight of the day still pressed heavily on her, but for the first time in hours, she felt something else, a flicker of hope. It was a small thing, fragile and fleeting, but it was enough to carry her forward. The rhythmic drone of the engine seemed louder in the early hours of the flight, an unbroken hum that filled the cabin with a muted sense of stillness. Naomi's teacup sat empty on the tray table, a faint ring of liquid at the bottom catching the soft amber glow of the overhead light. She leaned back in her seat, eyes closed but far from asleep, her thoughts tumbling over one another like restless waves. It wasn't just about Thornton anymore. Patricia Moore's words had planted a seed in her mind, a growing realization that this confrontation might be part of something larger, something she hadn't entirely anticipated. Naomi wasn't the type to seek out conflict, but this time she couldn't ignore the weight of what had happened, not when she could still feel the sting of Thornton's words echoing in her ears. A sudden burst of activity in the aisle drew her attention. Naomi opened her eyes to see a flight attendant whispering urgently to another near the galley, their expressions tense, their gestures sharp and hurried. Something was happening. Jonathan noticed it too, lowering his tablet and leaning slightly into the aisle to observe, his brow furrowed. He glanced at Naomi, a silent question in his eyes. She shrugged lightly, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed her unease. Moments later, Erica, the young flight attendant who had brought Naomi tea earlier, approached their row. Her face was pale and drawn. She knelt beside Jonathan, her voice low enough to avoid disturbing the other passengers. "Mr. Carter," she began, glancing nervously at Naomi before continuing, "I thought you should know. Captain Thornton hasn't left the plane yet." Naomi's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice steady but edged with concern. Erica swallowed hard. "He was supposed to disembark after being relieved of duty, but we just found out he's still in the crew rest area. The new captain informed us a few minutes ago." Jonathan's jaw clenched, his expression darkening. "Why wasn't he removed immediately?" Erica hesitated, her gaze flicking to the floor. I think he talked his way into staying on board. He claimed he wanted to rest before his next flight." Jonathan stood abruptly, his heightened presence suddenly towering over the seated passengers. "That's unacceptable," he said, his voice low but firm. "Where is he now?" "In the back," Erica said quickly, "near the crew quarters. The cabin supervisor is speaking with him." Jonathan's eyes narrowed. "Take me there." Naomi reached out, her hand brushing against his sleeve. "Wait," she said softly, her voice grounding him. "Let me come with you." He hesitated, his eyes searching hers for a moment before nodding. "Okay, let's handle this together." The rear of the plane was noticeably quieter, the narrow aisles lined with darkened windows and sleeping passengers. As Naomi and Jonathan approached the crew rest area, the tension in the air grew heavier, the kind of charged silence that often preceded an argument. They found Thornton seated in a small fold-down chair near the galley, his posture relaxed, almost defiant. He looked up as they approached, his expression shifting from indifference to irritation. The cabin supervisor stood nearby, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her face etched with discomfort. "Thornton," Jonathan said, his voice sharp enough to slice through the quiet, "you were supposed to leave this plane. Why are you still here?" Thornton's lip curled into a faint sneer. "I didn't realize I needed your permission to rest," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Last I checked, I'm still an employee of this airline." Jonathan took a step closer, his presence commanding even in the cramped space. "You're not just any employee. You're someone who harassed and humiliated a passenger, my wife, no less, without cause. The fact that you're still sitting here shows a complete lack of respect for accountability." Thornton leaned back, crossing his arms. "You can't fire me," he said coolly. "That's for corporate to decide, and until they do, I'm entitled to remain on this plane as much as anyone else." Naomi stepped forward then, her voice cutting through the tension like steel wrapped in silk. "This isn't about entitlement," she said. "It's about responsibility. You abused your position of power, and now you're hiding behind technicalities instead of facing the consequences of your actions." Thornton's eyes flicked to her, and for a brief moment, she saw something there, guilt, perhaps, or fear, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same smug indifference he had worn earlier. Before Thornton could respond, Patricia Moore appeared at the edge of the galley, her arms crossed and her expression grim. She had clearly overheard the exchange, and she wasn't about to stay silent. "Thornton," she said, her voice carrying a weight of authority that made even the cabin supervisor stand straighter, "you've been skating by on arrogance for years, but you finally crossed a line you can't smooth-talk your way out of." Thornton's face darkened. "Who the hell are you?" Patricia stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "I'm someone who's seen enough of your kind to know exactly what you're doing. And let me tell you, this little act of defiance won't save you." The tension in the small space became almost suffocating. Naomi glanced at Jonathan, who was watching Thornton intently, his expression unreadable. Thornton's bravado began to falter under the weight of the scrutiny. The cabin supervisor, emboldened by Patricia's presence, spoke up for the first time. "Captain Thornton, I have already reported this incident to the airline's executive office. You should have been removed from this flight the moment Mr. Carter intervened." Thornton opened his mouth to argue, but seemed to think better of it. His shoulders sagged slightly, and the mask of arrogance slipped, revealing the uncertainty beneath. Jonathan took a step closer, his voice low but resolute. "This isn't just about one incident, Thornton. It's about a pattern of behavior that has no place in this industry or anywhere else. You can't run from this anymore." Thornton looked away, his jaw tightening. For the first time, Naomi saw a flicker of defeat in his eyes. The cabin supervisor stepped forward, her tone firm. "Captain Thornton, I'm instructing you to remain in the crew rest area for the remainder of this flight. Upon landing, security will escort you to the airline's disciplinary office. Further non-compliance will result in immediate termination." Thornton said nothing, his silence a reluctant acceptance of his fate. As the group dispersed, Naomi felt a weight lift from her chest, though the journey was far from over. As she and Jonathan made their way back to their seats, Naomi felt his hand brush against hers, a silent gesture of reassurance. They had stood together, and they would continue to do so, no matter how long the road to justice might be. For the first time since the flight began, Naomi allowed herself to truly relax. The stars outside the window seemed brighter now, their light a quiet reminder that even in the darkest skies, hope could shine through. The cabin lights had dimmed further as the hours crept into the early morning. The world outside was an endless expanse of black, broken only by the faint glimmer of stars. Inside the plane, a heavy stillness hung in the air, a fragile balance of tension and exhaustion. Naomi sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She could still feel the faint tremor in her fingers from the confrontation with Thornton. The man's smug face lingered in her mind, a stark reminder of how deeply ingrained arrogance could be when left unchecked. But beneath the weariness, there was something else, a quiet sense of triumph. Thornton had been silenced, his power stripped away, at least for the moment, and that, Naomi knew, was a step toward something greater. Jonathan sat across the aisle, his tablet forgotten on the tray table. He had been watching her in that quiet, observant way of his, as though gauging her mood without needing to ask. When their eyes met, he offered a faint smile, the kind that always reminded her she wasn't alone. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked gently. Naomi shook her head, her lips curving into a tired smile. "Not yet. I think I just need to sit with it for a while." Jonathan nodded, his gaze softening. "Take your time." The cabin was hushed, most passengers asleep or lost in their own thoughts. The faint clink of glassware and the soft shuffle of the flight crew moving through the aisles were the only sounds. Naomi sipped the last of her tea, the warmth settling in her chest like a balm. She was beginning to feel the pull of sleep when a shadow fell over her seat. It was Patricia Moore again, standing beside her with a small folded piece of paper in her hand, her expression serious but with a flicker of warmth in her eyes. "May I?" Patricia gestured toward the empty seat beside Naomi. Naomi nodded, curious. "Of course." Patricia settled into the seat, smoothing her skirt over her knees. She unfolded the paper and handed it to Naomi. It was a handwritten note, the letters neat and deliberate. Naomi read the words slowly, her brows knitting together as the meaning sank in. It wasn't a letter of encouragement or a simple thank you, it was a detailed account of Thornton's behavior on past flights, a timeline of incidents that Patricia had personally witnessed. Some were minor, easily dismissed as poor judgment, but others were damning unwarranted accusations, discriminatory comments, and reports of passengers requesting to switch flights after interactions with him. "I wasn't sure if I should share this," Patricia said softly, breaking the silence, "but after what I saw tonight, I realized it's not enough to just sit on the sidelines. People like him thrive on silence." Naomi set the note on her lap, her fingers brushing the edges of the paper. The weight of it felt tangible, a collection of truths that had been hidden for far too long. "Thank you," Naomi said, her voice steady despite the swirl of emotions inside her. This could make a real difference. Patricia nodded. Use it however you see fit. I just wanted you to know you're not alone in this. For the first time that night, Naomi felt a surge of hope, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been forced to endure Thornton's behavior without recourse. She folded the note carefully and slipped it into her purse, where it felt like a shield waiting to be wielded. After Patricia returned to her seat, Naomi leaned back, her thoughts racing. The note was more than evidence, it was a reminder of the power of collective voices. She had spent so much of her life fighting battles alone, but this time she wasn't just speaking for herself. There were others, people who had been wronged, people who hadn't had the chance to speak up, and now she had the opportunity to be their voice. Jonathan shifted in his seat, drawing her attention. He raised an eyebrow, silently asking if she was all right. Naomi gave him a small nod, her lips curving into a faint smile. I think I know what I need to do, she said quietly. Jonathan's expression softened. Whatever it is, you have my full support. Naomi reached across the aisle, her fingers brushing his. The simple touch grounded her, a reminder of the partnership that had carried them through so much. I know, she said, and that's enough. As the hours wore on, Naomi found herself staring out the window, the stars a silent audience to her thoughts. She thought about the confrontation with Thornton, about Patricia's note, and about the many passengers who had watched the events unfold in silence. Some had offered support, but most had looked away, unwilling to involve themselves in the conflict. It wasn't their fault, Naomi reminded herself. Fear was a powerful thing, and it often kept people from doing what they knew was right. But she couldn't ignore the nagging thought that silence had its cost, a cost she had felt deeply tonight. Jonathan's voice broke the silence, low and steady. You're thinking about the next step, aren't you? Naomi turned to him, her eyes thoughtful. Yes, she admitted, but it's more than that. It's about how to make it count, how to make sure this isn't just another story that gets buried. Jonathan nodded slowly. You've already started that process by standing your ground, by speaking up. You've planted a seed, now it's about nurturing it. Naomi considered his words, the truth in them resonating deeply. This wasn't just about Thornton, it was about challenging the system that had allowed him to thrive. And while the path ahead felt daunting, it was one she was ready to walk. I'll need your help, she said, her voice soft but firm. Jonathan smiled, his eyes warm with pride. You'll have it, every step of the way. The first hints of dawn began to creep into the sky, casting a pale golden glow over the horizon. Naomi watched as the darkness slowly gave way to light, the transition subtle but unstoppable. It felt like a metaphor for the journey she was about to embark on, a reminder that even the darkest nights couldn't hold back the morning. As the plane began its descent, Naomi felt a sense of clarity settle over her. This wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning. And for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to face whatever came next. She reached into her purse, her fingers brushing against Patricia's note. It was a small thing, but it held the weight of something much larger, a promise of change, a chance to rewrite the narrative. Naomi looked at Jonathan, her voice steady and sure. Let's make this right. He nodded, his hand closing over hers. Let's do it together. As the plane touched down, the wheels skimming the runway with a low rumble, Naomi felt a flicker of something she hadn't expected, hope. It was fragile, but it was there, a light in the distance guiding her forward. And she knew, without a doubt, that this was only the beginning. The plane taxied to its gate, the steady rumble of the engines vibrating through the cabin. Passengers stirred awake, stretching or collecting their belongings. The weight of the night's events still clung to Naomi, though the flicker of hope within her burned brighter now. Her hand brushed against the note in her purse, a tangible reminder of the responsibility she carried. Jonathan stood, reaching for their carry-on bags from the overhead compartment, his movements calm and deliberate, a quiet reassurance that they were a team, no matter what lay ahead. Naomi adjusted her blazer, smoothing the creases, and rose to her feet. She caught a glimpse of Patricia Moore, who gave her a firm nod, as if to say, "You've got this." As the cabin doors opened and passengers began to disembark, Naomi hesitated. Thornton was somewhere on this plane, likely waiting for the all-clear to slip away unnoticed. A part of her wanted to confront him again, to demand accountability in front of everyone, but another part, the quieter voice of wisdom, reminded her that the real reckoning wouldn't happen here. It would happen where it mattered most, within the airline's leadership and its policies. Naomi and Jonathan stepped into the terminal, the fluorescent lights bright and unforgiving after the dim cabin. They were met almost immediately by a representative of SkyConnect Airlines, a sharp-dressed man with an apologetic expression. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," he began, his tone careful, "my name is Peter Reynolds. I'm the Regional Operations Manager. First, let me extend my deepest apologies for what happened on your flight. We take incidents like this very seriously, and I assure you there will be an immediate investigation." Jonathan stepped forward, his presence commanding. "An investigation isn't enough," he said firmly. "This isn't an isolated incident. Captain Thornton's behavior reflects a deeper issue within your organization, one that requires immediate and comprehensive action." Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Carter, and I assure you no, you don't understand," Naomi interrupted, her voice steady but unyielding. "This isn't just about frustration. It's about the systemic failures that allow people like Thornton to continue abusing their positions of power. If you truly want to make this right, you'll need to do more than apologize." Reynolds hesitated, clearly caught off guard by her directness. "What do you propose?" he asked finally. Naomi glanced at Jonathan, who gave her a subtle nod. She stepped closer to Reynolds, her voice firm. "I propose a full review of Thornton's record and a transparent process for addressing passenger complaints. But more importantly, I want to ensure that every employee, from pilots to ground staff, undergoes mandatory training on bias and professionalism." Reynolds blinked, clearly unprepared for her measured yet bold demands. "That's a significant request," he said slowly. "It's the bare minimum," Jonathan interjected. "And as a shareholder in this company, I'll personally see to it that these changes are implemented." Reynolds nodded, his expression softening into something that looked almost like respect. "Understood. I'll escalate this to senior leadership immediately." As Reynolds walked away, Naomi exhaled deeply, the tension in her chest finally beginning to ease. Jonathan placed a hand on her back, a gentle reminder that she wasn't carrying this burden alone. "You were incredible," he said softly. Naomi smiled, though her eyes were tired. "I just said what needed to be said." Jonathan shook his head. "No, you did more than that. You showed them what real leadership looks like." She glanced around the terminal, the bustling crowd moving past them as though nothing extraordinary had happened. To them, it was just another day, another flight, but to Naomi, it was a turning point, a moment when she had chosen to stand up, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced. The sound of approaching footsteps drew Naomi's attention. Thornton appeared, flanked by two security personnel, his face drawn and pale, the arrogance stripped away. He caught sight of Naomi and Jonathan, his eyes flickering with something that might have been regret or perhaps just fear of the consequences to come. Naomi met his gaze, her expression calm but unwavering. She didn't say anything, she didn't need to. The silence spoke louder than words. "You don't get to win," she thought, as Thornton was led away. The following weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, statements, and plans for change. Naomi and Jonathan worked closely with SkyConnect's leadership, ensuring that the promises made in the terminal were followed through. Patricia Moore provided her testimony, her detailed accounts of Thornton's behavior serving as a crucial piece of evidence. The airline announced a sweeping set of reforms: mandatory training for all employees, a new system for reporting and addressing complaints, and a commitment to fostering diversity and inclusion at every level. Thornton was officially terminated, his record marked with the incidents he had tried so hard to deny. But for Naomi, the most significant change was the ripple effect. Passengers began sharing their own stories, inspired by her courage. Each voice added to the chorus, a collective demand for accountability and respect. Months later, Naomi found herself standing at a podium, the bright lights of a conference room casting a warm glow on her face. She was delivering the keynote speech she had prepared for so long ago, the one that had been overshadowed by the events on that flight. Her voice was steady as she spoke, her words resonating with the audience. Adversity isn't just an obstacle, it's an opportunity. It's a chance to stand up, to speak out, and to create the change we want to see in the world. Jonathan sat in the front row, his expression one of quiet pride. He had been there every step of the way, her partner in every sense of the word. And as she looked out at the sea of faces before her, Naomi knew she wasn't alone in this journey. Together, they were building something stronger, a future where no one would have to fight these battles alone. Weeks later, as Naomi and Jonathan boarded a new flight for a well-earned vacation, the experience felt different. The crew greeted them warmly, their smiles genuine. Naomi took her seat in first class, her posture relaxed, her heart light. As the plane ascended into the sky, she gazed out the window, the clouds rolling past like waves on an endless sea. The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time in a long while, Naomi felt at peace. And she knew, with unwavering certainty, that the sky was no longer a limit, it was a promise of change, of growth, and of endless possibilities. Justice isn't always immediate, but when it arrives, it leaves a mark that can't be ignored. This wasn't just about one woman's fight, it was a reminder that standing up for what's right can spark change far beyond the moment. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, don't forget to hit subscribe and join us for more powerful stories that matter from Dark Stories. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.